Most disasters begin with something that feels obvious in hindsight. A warning light, a checklist item, a small problem that demands attention. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 did not fail because the aircraft stopped flying. It failed because the crew stopped watching it fly. In its accident report, adopted in June of 1973, the National Transportation Safety Board described the ending in plain language. A modern wide-body jet was cleared to hold at 2,000 feet near Miami. The crew became preoccupied with a landing gear indication issue, and the aircraft descended unnoticed for the final 4 minutes of flight. This is not a story about weather, or sabotage, or a catastrophic mechanical breakup. It is a story about attention, and what happens when a system assumes someone is looking. On December 29th, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, bound for Miami. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, tail number N310EA. There were 163 passengers aboard and 13 crew members. The flight was routine. Approaching Miami late that night, the aircraft was cleared for an instrument approach. Then, a single green light failed to illuminate. It was the nose landing gear position indicator, the kind of bulb that should not matter, the kind of bulb that rarely becomes the center of a crash report. But in the cockpit, it mattered enough to stop forward motion. The crew initiated a missed approach and requested time to troubleshoot. Air traffic control vectored the flight into a holding pattern at 2,000 feet, a safe altitude, a controlled environment, a pause. What happened next is why this case has never left aviation history. The landing gear itself was not the failure. The board later found there was no structural malfunction before impact, and that the issue centered on the indication system. The nose gear position light assembly had become the focus. The report notes that the lens assembly was removed and incorrectly reinstalled, and that both bulbs in the nose landing gear position indicating system were burned out. This is where the descent begins, because once the cockpit decides a small problem is urgent, everything else becomes background noise. The first officer worked to remove the jammed light assembly. The captain divided his attention between helping and directing others to check the issue. A jump seat occupant and the second officer moved to the forward electronics bay to try to visually confirm the nose gear down position. The crew devoted approximately 4 minutes to the distraction, with minimal regard for other flight requirements. 4 minutes is nothing, until it is everything. The aircraft remained on autopilot, but the autopilot was being used in basic control wheel steering mode. The board recorded that the autopilot was utilized in basic CWS, and that the crew was unaware of the low force gradient input required to effect a change in aircraft attitude while in that mode. This detail matters because it turns a cockpit into a room full of assumptions. Assumptions that the aircraft is holding altitude. Assumptions that someone is monitoring instruments. Assumptions that a minor bump or pressure on the controls cannot change the outcome. The board's findings show the core failure was not one action. It was the absence of a role. No one was assigned to do the simplest job in that moment: watch the altitude. In the report's own words, the captain failed to assure that a pilot was monitoring the progress of the aircraft at all times. So, the aircraft did what aircraft do when no one is watching closely enough. It kept flying, just not where it was supposed to be. The TriStar began to descend, not sharply, not dramatically. A slow, shallow loss of altitude that can hide inside cockpit workload. As the aircraft descended through 1,750 feet, an oral altitude alert sounded. The board found the crew did not hear it. There is a moment in many accidents where a system tries to interrupt human focus. A horn, a chime, a warning tone designed to cut through tunnel vision. But warning systems have one weakness. They still rely on people to recognize what the sound means. And in that cockpit, the sound did not register as danger. The crew remained preoccupied with confirming the position of the nose gear. Outside, the Everglades waited. A flat, dark surface that offers almost no visual cues at night. No rising terrain to trigger instinct. No city lights beneath to suggest altitude loss. Just darkness. And then impact. At approximately 23:42 Eastern Standard Time, the aircraft struck the Florida Everglades. The NTSB report places the crash roughly 18.7 miles west-northwest of Miami International Airport. The aircraft was destroyed, and the numbers that followed became the permanent signature of Flight 401. Of the 163 passengers and 13 crew members aboard, 94 passengers and 5 crew members received fatal injuries. 75 people survived. This is the part where most people expect fire. But the report notes there was no fire until after impact, when the integrity of the left wing fuel tanks was destroyed. In a swamp, survivability becomes a cruel variable. Water can cushion. It can also trap. It can extinguish. It can also carry fuel. And in the dark, it can hide survivors from rescuers moving blindly through reeds and broken structure. The Everglades are not an airport environment. They are mud, water, sawgrass, and distance. In the first hours after the crash, rescue was not driven by a clean system. It was driven by whoever could reach the site, airboats, helicopters when available, first responders trying to move through terrain that was never designed for emergency access. Survivors were spread through fractured cabin sections. Some were injured severely, some were disoriented, some were trapped. The fact that 75 people lived is part of why this case stayed visible. It was not a disappearance. It was a catastrophe with witnesses. And that means the final minutes had to be explained with more than mythology. They had to be explained with instruments, recordings, and procedural failure. When investigators wrote the probable cause, they did not hide behind complexity. They wrote it as a human failure. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight, and to detect an unexpected descent soon enough to prevent impact with the ground. And they named the trigger. Preoccupation with a malfunction of the nose landing gear position, indicating system distracted the crew's attention from the instruments and allowed the descent to go unnoticed. In the findings, the board describes a cumulative result, not one error, several minor deviations from normal operating procedures, which triggered a sequence of events with disastrous results. This is the anatomy of descent, a distraction that feels legitimate, a cockpit that becomes task-focused, a system that keeps running, a role that is never assigned, and an ending that arrives without warning because warning was never being watched. Flight 401 did not just become a case file. It became a lesson, not because it was unique, but because it was explainable. The aircraft was certificated, equipped, and maintained in accordance with applicable regulations. The crew was trained, qualified, and certified for the operation. Nothing about the setup suggests recklessness, which is why the outcome became so important for how aviation thought about human performance. In the years that followed, aviation research increasingly focused on resource management, communication, workload, and the way crews allocate attention under pressure. The roots of crew resource management training in the United States are often traced to NASA's 1979 workshop titled Resource Management on the Flight Deck. That shift is the larger legacy of Flight 401, because the crash was not caused by a lack of skill. It was caused by a lack of structure inside the cockpit when something small went wrong. Who flies? Who troubleshoots? Who monitors? Those roles cannot be assumed. They have to be assigned. Flight 401 has another layer that refuses to disappear. After the crash, stories began circulating in aviation folklore that deceased crew members were seen on other aircraft. In many retellings, the claim is that salvaged parts from Flight 401 were installed into other TriStar aircraft, and that sightings were tied to those planes. But this is where factual ground becomes unstable. Even within published accounts, the details conflict. Aviation historian Robert J. Serling later disputed the idea that wreckage from Flight 401 was installed and removed from other aircraft as the rumors claimed, and he rejected the notion that the sightings were confirmed in any reliable way. So, in a true crime documentary frame, the haunting is not evidence, it is aftermath behavior, a workplace processing trauma, a story trying to give shape to a death that felt too preventable. Folklore grows fastest when the mechanism is simple enough to understand. Because when the cause is attention, the mind refuses to accept that the ending could be that clean. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is remembered because it violates what people want to believe about tragedy. That complex disasters require complex causes. That safety systems catch the obvious. That experienced professionals cannot miss what is right in front of them. But the NTSB did not describe a mystery. It described an ending built from small, ordinary failures. A crew distracted by a landing gear indication. An aircraft descending unnoticed for 4 minutes. An alert that went unheard. A role that was never assigned. This is why the title fits. Descent is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is procedural. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it happens inside a cockpit full of people who believe they have time. This was a descent horror story. And in the Everglades, the system learned a rule it could not afford to forget. A plane can fly perfectly, all the way into the ground. If you'd like to stay with Entity Shadows for more carefully documented stories told with restraint and respect, you're welcome to subscribe.